Hi, welcome to the Law of Fojo podcast. I am your host, Robert Fojo, and with me today is Josh Lewis. Josh has a podcast of his own. It's called Saving Elephants Millennials Defending and Expressing Conservative Values. He is a CPA in Oklahoma. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And he calls himself a student of conservatism, which I admire greatly. He podcasts and blogs extensively about the historical and intellectual tradition of conservatism in America, including the roots of modern conservative thought. We were just talking before we started recording. So you're in Oklahoma. You mentioned this trend or activity of diving into a an ice cold body of water, whether a pool or something else. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because I've always resisted the idea of doing that for obvious reasons, but apparently you've done it
Uh,
yourself.
Most normal people resist the idea of doing that. That's the last thing you want to do. I honestly can't step by step tell you exactly how I got there, but I just ha- have honestly enjoyed diving into a swimming pool in freezing conditions outside. Probably short periods of time for people that are actual experienced polar bear plungers, say. But there's just something about it that I mean, look, I'll be the first to admit it never gets easier. It feels like your body's on fire. It goes from being cold to just lava hot. You're in extreme pain,
Mm.
but I've got a smile on my face, and it wakes you up, and it just sort of exfoliates the skin. And like I said, I don't have any evidence for this. I've heard a lot of people swear by it that it's good for mental health, it's good for physical condition. Um, uh, Not that there's that many people who would attempt this, but probably needs to come with a disclaimer. If you've never done this before, don't just jump into ice cold water. Like, work your way up to it. Your body does take a little bit to acclimate. But yeah, it's a rejuvenating way to start one's morning. I guarantee it works better than espresso waking you up in the morning.
What I That's going to take some convincing on my end because I usually defer to the espresso. Well, what time of day are you doing this? 6 in the morning, 7, or earlier than that?
Essentially, yeah, kind of
Yeah,
before I'm six or seven, probably closer to 7 o'clock. Sometimes before the sun comes up.
interesting. I'm a fitness nut and an avid CrossFitter, and I've read about the health benefits of they call them ice baths or cold therapy. And um, one option is to do what you do, dive into a swimming pool that's ice cold in at this time of year. Another option is to take a bag of ice, dump it into a bathtub,
Hmm.
fill it with water, and take a dip in there. And usually 5 minutes or 10 minutes is sufficient if you can withstand it for that long. I don't think I could do 1 minute, but it apparently has tremendous health benefits. It increases your metabolism. It helps the skin. It obviously and most certainly wakes you up, and it just has this just enormous value from what I understand. So I find it interesting that you do it, and apparently you just kind of how did you start doing that?
I don't honestly remember. I just know that, someone had kind of said I've heard this. It was almost like an impulsion one day. It's like, I
Huh.
wonder if that would help in some manner. And I just sort of, I think at one point it felt like kind of a token on the man card. Hey, can I do this? Like, other people swear by it. And then I just started to notice it actually releases some sort of endorphins. Like, maybe I should push a little further, and it seemed to be an enjoyable activity. Now, again, let me give the disclaimer. I'm not, there's some avid polar bear plungers out there that can spend hours out in the ocean, in near freezing conditions. I've not attained those levels of, endurance.
Mhm.
But I can kind of attest to someone at just a very beginner novice stage. Yeah, and look, to each their own. You mentioned CrossFit. Like, I try CrossFit a little bit. I'm not built like that. And what always cracked me up was we would always start with like this little dinky half-mile run, and
Right.
you never heard so much complaining. And then we would start lifting these weights like, "Are you guys kidding me? I can do this on my side. I've run marathons before. Like, why are we?" So I think some of it are just constituted better. So trying to find that rhythm where lots of it, myself included, it's hard to exercise, but I think it's harder still if you don't identify what is it my actual body is okay with doing, it isn't going to fight
Sure.
me on.
Sure. Well, it's there's something for everybody. For some people, CrossFit isn't their thing. For many people in CrossFit included, running isn't their thing.
Yeah.
So I have you said you run marathons?
I have in the past. I've
Nice.
been out of training lately, but yeah, that was
I've done a
yeah.
few of those myself. Those are fun. And I mean the word fun in a very different way than most people would use it. So you take pride in calling yourself a millennial who defends and discusses conservatism, right?
Yes.
And why in particular do you emphasize the fact that you're a millennial? Is it because millennials don't may not necessarily, as a group, understand conservatism, or has is conservative thought among that group or that generation waning a bit?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess first and foremost, I am a millennial, which in your former guest, and I'm blanking on his name, the individual that talked about the generational differences or how we define those. I really
Rick
enjoyed that
Cromie.
episode. Yeah,
Hmm.
I quibble with some of his views, but I'm mostly in agreement that we have a ill-defined way of thinking of our generations. But I do identify as a millennial, and so that's first and foremost among it. I think conservatism is naturally an ill fit for any generation. It's not self-intuitive. It's something that upon reflection, I think it's true, and I think it is something that is helpful and needful in a society. But it takes more than just um, it's not self-sustaining, if you will. It has to be taught or demonstrated. I am particularly concerned about my generation because I think it's not so much we don't get it or have the capacity to. It's I think older generations seem to lack the capacity to share it in a way that's salient or relevant for us.
Mm,
And there's a lot more than just this, but in the case of millennials, for instance, there are interesting historical moments such as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Bush years, such as the 2008 market collapse, that I think don't set well in the minds of your average millennial. Pardon me. But among older conservatives, if you will, or older individuals on the right,
mm,
they don't seem to be explaining that in a way that is relevant to us because they've lived, for a lot of older Americans, they lived through global communism and the demise of the Soviet Union. I am every inch a capitalist, but I also recognize there is a danger in just sort of a set down, shut up. Hey, we've won the battle of socialism, and our only response to socialism is just that you have to be an idiot to accept that. I think that for a millennial who's especially younger millennials, my one of my earliest political memories was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, that
mm.
obviously I hadn't formed many political thoughts at that point. So I can historically look at that and it's relevant, but it's hard for me to kind of grasp, okay, well, what does it mean, this difference between capitalism and socialism? So I can
Yeah.
understand how my generation is and I suppose we would say our generation. I know you again, it's ill-defined where millennials start, but
Right.
I'll roll you into the fold. Let me. I don't mean to go on too long, but let me share this very brief story. Years ago, I was with the local Tulsa County Republican Party. We're setting up a booth at a fair. We had ahead of the time, the party had decided, let's try to appeal to younger Americans, not necessarily millennials, but just younger Americans. And they gave an older American the task of trying to design this booth in such a way that would appeal to younger Americans. Well, the committee's idea was let's make it all about technology because supposedly that's what makes millennials interested.
Mm,
This individual decorated the booth by hanging CD-ROMs from the rafters. An outdated technology. In fact, as I approached this booth for the first time, I was like, "What are those disco balls? What is that hanging out of the air?" Like, "Oh, those are CDs. This will get the young kids in there."
right.
And so I think to a certain degree, even back then, it was kind of this recognition that there's a disconnect between the generationals trying to communicate this, that we don't just throw flashy technology at the young people and that's what's going to get them in. Rather, we treat them at their level. What are you actually concerned about? What is it about the 2008 market collapse, the Iraqi wars, that may have invalidated much of the message of conservatism and capitalism in the Republican Party? And how do we effectively address that?
Right. I think it's interesting that, and it's a very valid point that you raised, that from one generation to the next, conservatism isn't being explained well. And I have always taken issue with that. I don't think my own parents explained it very well either. My parents are Cuban immigrants, so they fled a communist totalitarian regime. Um, and aside from short quips about communism is bad, our rights are important, any government that doesn't champion your rights is bad. Aside from, and I'm certainly not criticizing my parents. They instilled in me the value of freedom and how important it is. And they obviously demonstrated it by fleeing their own home
Mhm.
and taking up residence somewhere else. But aside from those short, nuanced lessons, the wider philosophy of conservatism was never taught to me, and it's certainly not being taught in schools. The way I learned conservative thinking and what that philosophy is all about is in the car while my dad was driving, listening to Rush Limbaugh. That's how I learned what conservatism was. But I think that that is a significant problem we have today, and political cycle after political cycle, which usually involves just marketing gimmicks and marketing plays. The ideas of conservatism often just get lost in the shuffle, and we have the issue of the day and people, I support Ukraine and this and that, and the ideas just get lost, especially among the political candidates. And I think that's a significant problem today.
No, I would agree, and I do take some hope in that that problem is not unique to the millennial generation. That it turns out when oftentimes in my podcast, I kind of say that I focus on non-current events because everyone else is talking about current events, and I find them more refreshing. Just like, well, what did Edmund Burke say 200 years ago, and how
Yeah,
might that apply today?
yeah,
This is something that the conservative godfathers and godmothers in the United States, especially ever since the end of World War II, have had a difficult time just trying to communicate. Like, how do we it conservatism started off really in the modern sense in America as a very ragtag organization of elites in a sense, trying to effectively communicate. And they were, ecstatic when they even got Barry Goldwater to become the Republican primary candidate for president. Of course, he lost in one of the most
oh,
lopsided defeats in American
yeah,
history.
trounced, yeah.
But at the time, that was a victory for conservatism because
Mhm.
we were still coming off the coattails of the FDR New Deal. That was, liberal orthodoxy is what dominates society for decades,
Right.
and even after that event. And so there was a very real sense in which there was this weird marriage between conservatism was defined as sort of the William F. Buckley elites, but there was also this is an imperfect analogy, but I'll borrow the Richard Nixon phrase of the silent majority, right? The great unwashed masses. That there always has been I would say, a conservative disposition among Americans. That unlike, say, Europeans or maybe even Cuba, where you're from, you're less likely to find neo-Nazis and hardcore Leninist Stalinists in the United States. Those sort of extremists, which do promulgate in other countries sometimes, you tend to find varying liberal orthodoxies type with here. Let's keep the system as is. So as a disposition, I think conservatism is very widespread in the United States. But as a complex ideological or philosophical approach, that's always been difficult to try to translate for the masses.
I find it interesting that and I agree with you that you believe that there is a conservative disposition among the American population. I remember going back to Rush Limbaugh, back in, I think it was 2008, there was a poll that he addressed and discussed on his program. It was called a battleground poll, and it was conducted by some outfit. I forget who it was. And they went into, I think it was 11 or 12 different battleground states, so the states that were considered swing states. And they polled people on how they would identify themselves, if they were very conservative, somewhat liberal, or very liberal. And 60% of the respondents were either very conservative or somewhat conservative. And he used that information to push the idea that these national elections, the candidate should be about espousing conservatism and pushing conservative ideals and explaining them, because that'll increase turnout. And if you can just get that segment of the population out to vote, you'll win every time. And in contrast, when you push a more milquetoast candidate, or someone who's more concerned with appeasing liberalism, or who's has much more watered down views of conservatism, you're more likely to lose. I'm thinking of the John McCains, the Mitt Romneys, and you know, for all his faults, George W. Bush had some conservative positions. Donald Trump had some conservative positions, but usually when those candidates come to the forefront, they increase turnout and they end up prevailing, whereas the milquetoast politicians tend to get lost in the shuffle. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a lot to think about that. One of the areas in which I admit I am out of step with, in a broad sense, I'll say the right, is there's this feeling in the air of we want someone who's going to fight for us. And of those four individuals you mentioned, George W. Bush, McCain, Romney, and Trump, I think most people would agree Trump is the odd man out. That he was the one that somehow galvanized this whole spirit of love him or hate him, he was a fighter. We all agreed he was fighting for something. Whereas the others seemed to, and maybe Bush is, predates some of those. Maybe we shouldn't put him in that category. But certainly if you contrast Trump's rhetoric with, say, McCain or Romney, they're very, it's very noticeable.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the poll that Limbaugh had cited or was referencing is if you look at, like, say, 100-year history of the United States, there was this sense in which, for the longest while, the general population, while they may have had a conservative disposition, were nonetheless, the general population or the working class, say, tended to be FDR Democrats. And what we have witnessed, I guess, around the 1960s, you might say, since some of the failures of the Great Society and LBJ, especially when you get to Reagan, where he popularized the term conservative and almost demonized the term liberal. Not single-handedly, of course, but that was kind of that era where this begins to shift. We have seen more and more and more with each passing year, the populist base is leaning more to the right, whereas your elitist, if you will, in the coastal cities tend to lean more to the left. Well, this is almost lopsided from how it used to be a century ago. And part of the reason I bring this up is kind of like, I was saying earlier with generations, these conversations get so messy that you can make truth claims about them that are in fact true. But there's 1,000 caveats to it. So I'm not necessarily, I agree with your dynamic. It's just there's obviously can be a lot of complexities around that because
absolutely.
And so I'm trying to think how best to put. I think there are various forms of how we can expect to see our candidates, say, tap into that sort of conservative disposition or sentiment. I also mentioned kind of that disposition of someone who fights on our behalf. I think that can range from a Ronald Reagan type who knows how to communicate, the great communicator knows how to effectively communicate deeper conservative truths, all the way down to demagogues. So that impulse in the Americans to both conserve and to fight is not necessarily good or bad. It's very latent. It can be seized upon by individuals who can use it for good or for ill.
That's a good point. Why do you think that shift happened from FDR Democrats to this this breakdown that we have today? Was it the failure of the Great Society and all of those liberal policies that were implemented?
I certainly think that was part of it. I mean, it's it's kind of like asking why did it would have been very surprising 150 years ago to learn that supposedly the Republicans is the party of the bigots and the Democrats are the the parties of the minority, when for most of our history it was quite the opposite.
Absolutely.
And so I don't. That's an excellent question. I do think the failures in the 1960s, and if you ask a Democrat or certainly a progressive, they would strongly contest that idea that the 1960s were somehow a failure. And in fact, from a policy perspective, one might argue they were one of the greatest successes. LBJ started a Great Society program that no successive administration or Congress has ever figured out how to turn off. So maybe we shouldn't call that a failure.
Yeah, and they continue to push those types of policies today in spite of we've had, I don't know how many trillions of dollars have been transfer of wealth. And when you hear a liberal politician, they're still arguing that America is a soup kitchen of sorts. And so that they still continue to push those types of policies and goals in spite of those failures.
There is and one of the things I like to focus on is saving elephants, pardon me. I get tongue-tied because I'm competing with people trying to save elephants, and so it's hard to find me on Google, which I support, by the way. It's a different focus.
Who wouldn't support saving elephants?
Who wouldn't support? Yeah, exactly. I support saving all kinds of elephants. One of the um, oh my gosh, and now I got sidetracked, and now I'm blanking. Oh, there we go. One of the things I like to focus on is sort of the underpinnings of where our beliefs come from. And Thomas Sowell, of course, who I'm assuming you may be familiar with.
Absolutely. I love his
Um,
columns.
yes, excellent, excellent writer. He's one of the best gateways, incidentally, to some of the deeper political thinkings because he's devastatingly brilliant, but he also writes for a general audience, even though he clearly could be producing academic,
Hmm.
treaties if he wanted. Anyhow, in his landmark book, or one of his many landmark books, uh, Conflict of Visions, he kind of talks about this general difference between, he doesn't call it left or right, he doesn't call it progressive conservative, he doesn't call it liberal conservative, he calls it constrained or unconstrained visions. And one of the things that is unique about conservatism, which I assume you would share, is we have a constrained vision that we naturally have an inclination to uh, be concerned. How was it that Daniel Patrick Moynihan put it? That somehow liberals lacked from the experience of life what conservatives gain at birth, which is a deep suspicion about the power of government to do good.
Hmm.
And it's this general notion that you can't make problems go away, no matter how much we want to. You can't, air quotes, solve problems. You can't, in the 1960s, they literally had a war on poverty. They were literally predicting we are going to end poverty in the United States. And if you just have the mindset of all it takes is the accumulation of wealth, which we had, it was post World War II. We were sitting on top of the world. If that's all it took, then I would agree. Yes, we could have eliminated poverty. But the conservative naturally has a disinclination of that view because there's a recognition that humans are limited, that we have a human nature that we cannot escape from, that we're not that much different than the humans of thousands of years ago. Maybe our technology's advanced and maybe certain advancements here, but things like religion, morality, these things don't advance, right? So we're the humans born today are more ethical than the ones born thousands of years ago.
Right.
Maybe our culture can inform us better, but at any rate, I guess I would say that that's always been an interesting kind of thought experiment to me, is it makes sense why individuals, the left, the Democrats, as you point out, still propagate these messages. It's not that they're ignorant, it's that they have a view of human nature that doesn't square with what the conservative has. That, well, no, if we can get the right individuals in charge and give them the right amount of power, we can in fact solve our problems. Whereas a conservative says that's nonsense.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the conservative perspective acknowledges the shortcomings of human nature, and I think you've sort of alluded to this in your answer, and that is simply because a human being is in a position of authority in government does not somehow eliminate those those drawbacks. Human nature, by definition, is fallible. We make mistakes. We're prone to biases and prejudices. We we have we're all unique in many different ways. Simply putting a human being in a position of power and asking them to enforce or execute some policy objective doesn't isn't always going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Human beings make mistakes, and there is, for the same reason that you wouldn't trust your neighbor to do X, Y, Z. Why would you trust your neighbor if they were in government to do X, Y, Z? Um, and so, because of that, government should be limited. It should serve specific purposes. Obviously, we need government for certain things to protect our rights and so on and so forth. But to implement a grand scale program to eliminate a problem in society, that's not what government was intended for, and it ignores the many drawbacks of having human beings be the ones in charge of doing that.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because another of Thomas Sowell's points is we naturally, I shouldn't say we, many individuals naturally have this sort of unusual view that somehow the private sector is morally compromised, whereas the public sector is not. And his point being, there's no, just because it's the public sector doesn't somehow make it altruistic. Those are still human beings occupying those sectors. Now,
Hmm.
caveat: I work for the government. I work for the state of Oklahoma. My observation there has been, because I do know that sometimes on the right there's this rhetoric that somehow when you work for government you're lazy, you're incompetent, you're corrupt. What I've observed is people in government are lazy, incompetent, corrupt, just like people in the private sector. it's the same basic stock. Now, one might be able to argue what attracts a person to various jobs can indicate what kind of personality they have, and that can be good or bad. There is some laziness that can accompany government. There's also a sense of public good, right? I'm in this not for myself, but to serve the public, and that can ignite the better angels of our nature.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a given that if we allow the say the public sector to take care of a problem that previously the private sector was taking care of, that somehow what we're really doing is empowering the angels. And I think that's at times where the left, I want to be careful I say this because the left does produce complex worldviews, and I don't mean to simplify them and just demonize them, but I think at times that's where they do get the notions that Republicans are bigots or ignorant. It's not so much that they know Republicans and know them to be that, it's more they presume, well, if we were in charge, here's what we would do. So the fact that the others are incapable or unwilling to do that must mean that they have some fallacy on their part, right? That
Right.
we have the best of intentions, and since they're not doing those things, maybe they don't have the best of intentions. And that's just, unfortunately, going back at Thomas Sowell, it's kind of a different framework for how we look at each other.
Yeah. How would you define conservatism?
I often say that conservatives spend a lot of time trying to define conservatism. We could spend an entire hour with me trying to define conservatism, but if I try to make this as simple as possible, I like Roger Scruton. Sir Roger Scruton passed away, God rest his soul, last year or a couple of years ago. British philosopher, and he said that it begins with a disposition, and Russel Kirk believed this, that it's you don't start with an ideology, you start with a disposition, right? A predilection, a feeling. Of which, as he put it, all sensible people agree, even non-conservatives, which is that good things are easily destroyed but not easily created. And therefore, we ought to maintain a sense of gratitude and almost selfish guardianship to maintain these good things. Now, from that, we flower outward. Part of the problem with defining conservatism, and this is a big argument within the right, is, are we defining, as someone put it, American conservatism or conservatism in America? In other words, is this the thing out there, air quotes, we could call conservatism, and this is the version in America, or is there something unique about the United States? Because, as some argue, what it meant to be a conservative in, say, the 1400s and the Ottoman Empire,
right,
is very different than what it means to be a conservative in the United States today. And traditionally, conservatives in the United States have been, to varying degrees, saying, well, what we're trying to uphold is the founding tradition. There's another problem, because if you go back and read the founders, it turns out those guys don't always agree with each other. So what do we mean? But I think within that sort of messy framework, there is, generally speaking, a notion that somehow what was birthed in the United States is that good thing that's easily destroyed but not easily created, that therefore we are grateful for and seek to maintain.
That's interesting. What I've come to believe or to understand as far as what conservatism is, it's about people. And you can obviously disagree with me if you want. But it's emphasizing that human beings are unique, and all of us have unique traits and characteristics, and we should advance those traits and emphasize the individual and rugged individualism. And that emphasis and that goal is the best method for advancing society and innovating and moving forward. That's how I view it. And obviously that you're going to hear something very different on the left, because the left likes to group people up into these little blocks and explain to them why they can't succeed and why they can't do X without the government to help them. But I like to think of it as, we love people and we want everyone to succeed. And the best way to help you succeed is to remove the constraints that are around you. And so I think that perhaps that ties into what you just identified, which is, and remind me again, what was it that you said? It was, we have a good thing, and
that good things are easily destroyed but not easily created.
So I think the good thing here is the person, the individual, and that's easily destroyed if you begin to erect boundaries and obstacles around the individual, and we need to keep that from being destroyed. That's how I view it, and I think that's how I would tie it to what you just said.
So there's first of all, I don't know that I would say I disagree with your definition.
Mm,
I would say that you have identified part of the argument that has been existing ever since, the historian George Nash ties it back to the end of World War II, that prior to that, its conservatism was slightly different. That there was this, what eventually became known as fusionism, the idea that we're going to, that libertarian thought, or the individualism, liberty, right? Rugged liberty,
right.
that loosely speaking is very similar to what you had just described, was somehow mutually reinforcing with traditionalism, with a respect for the past, with a deference to the slow accretion of knowledge and progress over time, rather than just sort of the radical ripping away and let's start anew. That is a difficult project to try to figure out how to put these two things together. There are individuals who completely deny this can be synthesized. There are others who say not only can they be synthesized, they are the same. It's mutually reinforcing, and they have to be synthesized. Um, where might be helpful, maybe for our purposes here in talking, is I consider myself to be a Burkean conservative. Edmund Burke,
Hmm.
the British philosopher slash politician, whose most famous work, Reflection on the Revolution at France, is very critical of the French Revolution. And this
Hmm.
is something, and specifically in the United States, there are American conservatives who disavow Burke for this very reason, because he was highly critical of the French Revolution. Well, the French Revolution had, fraternity, equality, liberty.
Yep.
American conservatives, at least the liberty part, are fully on board with that. So was Thomas Jefferson. So was Thomas Paine here in the United States. These are our brothers in arms. We just threw off the shackles of Great Britain. These guys are trying to throw off the Ancien regime. Aren't we? Aren't we similar? Isn't this the
Yeah.
same basic thing? What Burke argued was that you don't just revolutionize a system and expect liberty to work. And if we take an extreme example, we might point to, as I was talking earlier, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That it turns out it's difficult to just topple a dictator and somehow that produces a flowering democracy.
Right.
That there's something unique about the American and the British cultures, that, this is something I've heard you express many times in your show. We do have America has this cantankerous version of, you're not going to tell me what to do. Now, that can be problematic, but it can also be very highly conducive to the sort of liberty that we enjoy. And that is not something that you just get in a classroom, or abstract ideas, or even applying Lockean principles. It's something that develops slowly over time with the culture. And so I think I guess where I'm going with this is, I very much agree with what you said. But when I think of conservatism, I think it also infuses these other ideas
Hmm.
within it. If all we're talking about is the individual versus the collective left,
Hmm.
as they understand it, grouping people, then yes, I'm part of the individualist. But I also think conservatism incorporates into it this general notion of, there's a slow accretion over time and cultural developments that allow for liberty to flourish.
Interesting. Um, who? So you called yourself a Burkean conservative. Who else helped shape conservative thought?
Wow. Well, I have a blog post, 50 conservative thinkers worth your time.
Let's go with the top five, or
Well,
the
yeah, exactly.
five
Yeah, I'm not
most.
gonna.
Is you've mentioned Russell Kirk, you've mentioned Edmund Burke, you've mentioned Thomas Sowell. Who else, in addition to, other than those um, thinkers, helped shape
Yeah,
conservative thinking?
in addition to those individuals, William F. Buckley, I think you cannot understand modern American conservatism without
Mm,
understanding Buckley. He was at the forefront, incidentally, of that fusionist idea of, he brought together the libertarians and the traditionalists into what we now identify as kind of modern conservatism. Now, a lot of people disagree with Buckley today. There's a lot of people on the right that say he doesn't perfectly embody that, but I would even say among those individuals, they would probably need to acknowledge that he was extremely instrumental in the conservative movement.
mhm.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell is, uh, I wouldn't say necessarily as instrumental in what the average conservative thinks, but I think one of our greatest, probably the greatest living conservative today, in terms of just his intellectual genius and output, and well worth studying. There are others, if you want to stand outside of America. I mentioned Roger Scruton, of course.
Mhm.
His landmark works help define conservatism, but um, and if we're looking at, say, the founding generation, the writings of John Adams, James Madison,
Mhm.
maybe to a lesser degree George Washington, and I don't mean to denigrate him, just in terms of conservatism. Uh, Washington wasn't necessarily as much a contributor, but Adams and Madison certainly. Um, yeah, I don't mean to just rattle off a lot of names.
No,
Is
no,
that,
I
do you want to?
that's fine. I just want I know you've written a lot about this. I've read some of your blog posts, and I think it's helpful to identify some of these individuals in terms of helping people understand that this is a very it's a prominent philosophy that's been written about, gosh, ad nauseum for 3-4 centuries at this point,
Yeah.
perhaps even longer. I think I've always thought that if anyone wanted to truly understand where, if you want to go back to understanding the 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 thinking that was prominent during the founding, is to go read the Federalist Papers,
Hmm.
because those works were essentially defensive of the basis for what they were trying to accomplish at the Constitutional Convention, and in drafting this truly revolutionary document. I always try to I tell people to go and check those out and read that, and it'll help you understand how these people thought and how they approached that gargantuan and transcendent event.
Hmm.
Um, do you think the Republican Party embodies conservatism today?
No, but that's a complex answer. Look, I mean, one has to ask, has it ever embodied conservatism? And I think
Mhm,
it waxes and wanes throughout the year. I think part of the reason it's called saving elephants is I have friends who are, um, I'll say broadly speaking, Trump skeptic. Well, let me just get this out here, and I don't know if this is the direction you want to take the conversation or not, but I am what I would call a Trump skeptic.
mhm,
I'm not a never Trumper because I don't know what that word means past the 2016 election. I don't know how you build an entire worldview out of I just don't like this guy, but I am very um, displeased, I'll say, with the direction that Trump has taken the party. That being said, I also strongly believe that if conservatism is to survive in a political sense in the United States, the most likely thing to happen in our lifetimes is for it to inhabit the Republican Party. And there are still
mhm,
certainly lots of Republicans that I celebrate and say, hey, I think they do embody the conservative spirit. I don't, it's conceivably possible, but I'm not looking for the Democratic Party to moderate and eventually start producing conservative candidates. It's happened in the past, way before we were alive, but they tend to be going more and more radical from what I can tell.
right.
And so when I look at this, because I also don't think a third party is a viable option. Maybe at some point in the future, maybe as some people say, how does a Ben Sass and a Donald Trump exist in the same party? How does a Liz Cheney and a Donald Trump exist in the same party? Like, could this split? But I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's still going to be a very uncomfortable Big Tent. um, Maybe I should slow down there because I'm sure there's a lot of directions we could go from here. But I would say that part of the mission of Saving Elephants is trying to call back. I think not that I was ever satisfied with the direction the Republican Party was going, but I think it's kind of gone even further in a direction I'm uncomfortable with. And part of the saving of elephants is trying to call it back to what I think is a healthier, more mature version
Mhm.
of politics.
Yeah, I I think Trump had I was I was a severe skeptic of Trump as well in 2016, because rather in 2015 when he decided he wanted to run, because I had recalled him praising Barack Obama back in '09 when Obama was inaugurated. I remember he gave an interview, I forget on which of the networks it was, but he was praising how articulate Obama was and how professional he was, and he contrasted him to Bush, and he was chastising the Bush administration. So that was my last memory of Trump, aside from all of the skits and The Apprentice and all those other sketches. So when he decided to run, I was very skeptical. I was like, "Who is he? Is he even a Republican?"
Hmm.
And I was a Ted Cruz supporter at the time. That was, in my opinion, he was probably the most conservative candidate amongst the field for the Republican primary. But then Trump came out with the immigration position, build the wall and all that, and that obviously resonated with a lot of people. And I think he did some good things in terms of trying to reduce the size of government. And I think that that's very important because that's very consistent with conservative thinking. We have this mess in Washington D.C. that needs to be curtailed, and whatever effort anyone can implement to do that, I always support that. I and I think he did very well with the Supreme Court justice appointment. So I think he did some good things. I agree with you. He has some issues, and I think that it might be a good idea to get away from constantly fighting the media, constantly fighting the left, and trying to articulate some substantive ideas, because I think that would be the opportunity to do it. I think it's his race to lose in 2024 if he decides to run. That is such a golden opportunity to take all that energy and use it to advance some set of substantive ideas that are consistent with conservatism, and take advantage of that environment to perhaps educate people and solve this issue that we alluded to at the beginning, which is people haven't explained conservatism very well.
And very few do. I mean, look, as an an historian as an avowed conservative myself, I mean, in my view, we've really, and I'm not completely supportive of them, but we've really only had two air quotes conservative presidents in the past, more than a century: Calvin Coolidge and Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
They got some things right, they got some things wrong. Same with Donald Trump. I mean, heck, every president, even my least favorite presidents, have gotten some things right. Donald Trump was, I've often said, consistent about two broad issues way before he was president. The Trump of the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s was always promulgating these two basic ideas about immigration control and about free trade.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the two things he's very consistent about. I understand I had similar concerns. And while I was, probably fair to say between the two of us, far more critical of Trump throughout his presidency, I did also share a sigh of relief that he was not the leftist in, the wolf in sheep's clothing that we were concerned he might be when he became the nominee for the Republican Party. Because you could certainly look at certain quotes and be like, well, is this guy the liberal? Like, what? I don't know what he actually, but like I say, he was consistent about those two basic ideas, but everywhere else, I really think you could have an alternative universe in which he would have been a more milquetoast liberal type president, because it seemed like those two issues, and then Donald Trump being about Donald Trump brand, right? What he did very early on was he grafted onto, largely speaking, the conservative movement. I was not a huge supporter of Ted Cruz. I'm glad we kind of start with this. How do you define conservatism? Because it gets messy in a hurry. I wouldn't necessarily consider him to be the most conservative of the candidates at that time. I would say that he was probably the best representative of the Tea Party movement, of that particular element within conservatism. And Donald Trump was able to, because one of the elements of the Tea Party movement, as we were talking earlier, is the fighter, the guy that, we want someone to fight for us. It turns out Trump was a better fighter than Cruz and was able to undermine him and in some sense steal that movement away from him. Now, part of the problem, and I don't have an easy solution or even any solution here, part of the problem was, how do we move beyond this, is that sentiment is not only still there, it's stronger today. It turns out electing Joe Biden, who was supposed to kind of reset the clock and make, let's in his inaugural address, sort of the unity candidate, has failed utterly to unify. It's not that, in my opinion, he's really tried. But getting Trump off Twitter, unfortunately, didn't calm us all down. If anything, we're even more upset with each other. And so I don't, and that's the $1 million question. Is he going to run in 2024? I don't know. I don't know that anybody does. I don't even know if he does at this point. But we still have in the ether that same basic desire to elect the fighter. That's not all bad. I'm not just completely against that. But I think it naturally disincentivizes us to look to the healthier aspects of what conservative has on offer. And I don't know how we get past that, because I don't see that the kind of conservatism, I'll be the first to admit, the kind of conservatism I am offering is not easily transmittable to the masses. Now, maybe at some point in the future, a Ronald Reagan type figure can find a way to do that. I am not a Ronald Reagan figure. I don't know how to communicate that
Yeah.
effectively, to the average Joe. I'm the first to admit that, but I think each of us have our little role to play, and maybe what I can do is keep the torch burning until others can find a way to push this forward.
That's a great point, because I think that politicians often, the ones who prevail tend to know how to craft their message the most effectively. And you can see this in several nuanced examples. Do you remember Herman Cain?
Oh yeah.
I he achieved popularity during that primary season before the left took him out with the all of the allegations. But he, for a short period of time there, he became the front runner among the field because of that message, the 999 message.
Hmm.
And that was a short, brief, essentially a marketing play that he, uttered over and over again. It was part of his platform, and people loved it. And people love those short, effective messages. And I think that the politicians who know how to do that effectively and have some substance behind it tend to get to the front of the line. Trump figured out how to do that, and he continues to do that pretty effectively. So it's a I guess it's the challenge is finding that combination of having the ideas in place, but also the messaging has to be right. Ronald Reagan knew how to do it very well. Obviously, that's why they call him the great communicator. Trump, he's got the messaging right, but sometimes the ideas are somewhat in flux, or he focuses on the wrong one. Obviously, immigration is a huge concern for everybody, but when that's your principal platform position, a lot else gets lost in the shuffle. And when he makes it his focus to just continually fight the media, which I'm fine with because the media has pissed me off over and over again. I think if we didn't have a media, if we didn't have a mainstream media in this country, I think Republicans would likely win every single election. So I'm okay with that. I wish at times there was a little bit less of that and more of what is the position, what are the ideas, and let's try to push this forward because there are a lot of problems in our system of government that need to be solved, other than the media and immigration.
Hmm.
Um,
Well,
Go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. I thought uh, I was just gonna. We both mentioned Reagan, and I thought the economist Milton Friedman said of Reagan once. I thought this was really interesting that Reagan was the first president in his lifetime who was elected not chiefly because he was saying what everyone wanted to hear, but because people began to want to hear what he had always been saying.
Hmm.
And he said by that, this was the same guy that gave the rendezvous with Destiny speech, to help Barry Goldwater. Well, he was rejected then. Then the 1970s, he ran a similar campaign, and he was rejected, and the Republicans instead elected Gerald Ford. And I guess one could argue he probably honed and perfected his message over the years.
Sure.
But Friedman's point was, it wasn't just that Reagan was the great communicator. It was also that the people of the United States eventually came around to saying, maybe this guy's right.
Hmm.
And I think in our polarized world, this is a sense in which, and this is something conservatism has right, is we do focus on the Burkean small platoon of the family local communities and also the individuals. It's not just about the right leaders crafting the right messages. It's also about the people of the United States desiring those things. And that requires a judicious approach. It requires a lot of virtues that I'm sad to say we seem to be lacking, of patience, of temperance, um, of trade-off, of being willing to say, maybe maybe there are ways in which we could compromise or advance, rather than just own the libs, say,
Right.
what are some ways in which we can improve society? If the people of the United States aren't interested in a conservative message, unfortunately, I don't know that it matters how effective the communicator is. Obviously, that's important and it has to happen. But I think there's also a sense, and this is part of what I'm trying to do with Saving Elephants, is it's not all about waiting for that right leader. It's also about we, the people, uh, being a moral people. As John Adams said, that our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people. It's inadequate for any other, and I think he's right. Unfortunately, as beautiful as the Constitution is, it doesn't work if the people stop working.
Hmm. I I think you I think that's a good point, and I it reminds me of something you wrote in one of your blog posts, and I think it was a Burkean idea, which is if we want to change anything, we need to work within the traditions that exist, and we can't just take a sledgehammer to it.
Hmm.
And that's often what Trump is guilty of this. Many leaders are guilty of this. Liberals are often very guilty of this
Hmm.
when they try to change something too quickly, and they don't realize that you need to approach it in baby steps. But I think that it sounds like that's what you're alluding to, that concept, the idea that yeah, the ideas need to be right, the messaging needs to be right, but if the people aren't ready for it, it's not going to work. You need to have all three in place, or you need to work within the system and the traditions that we have, and perhaps do it in a more methodical way. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it is very discouraging to me that somehow we have equated you become more conservative with the more you want to smash the system. That is literally the opposite of conservatism. Now, that's not the same as that. Look, I'm opposed to Obamacare. It's part of the system, right? So these things only go so far. There's a sense in which you have to say, okay, what if the system's wrong? But it's not that there's never an instance in which smashing the system is a bad idea. It's just that I think we are far too um, unwilling to consider all of the many things that go wrong when you just break something apart. Because, and this
Right.
is the Burkean idea, it's just like language, it's just like the economy. Billions of people make individual decisions every day. This is so complicated. There is no one person that would ever be intelligent enough to know how to break it all apart and put it back together. We can all point to it and say it's wrong and it's bad. And I can agree with that. And maybe we need to move in a different direction. But it is the way it is for a reason. Lots of decisions that neither of us and no one else is ever going to be smart enough to figure out how to pull apart and reconstruct. And so we have to be very cautious about just tearing things apart.
Yeah. One of the things I've been struggling with, because I think that the system we have in place, and let me be more specific for in preparation for what I'm about to say. The system of separated branches of government, the executive, the legislative, the judiciary. One of the things I've come to realize in my work as an attorney, and in many of the battles that I've had, I spent the last 2 years fighting COVID restrictions on behalf of clients, and I kept coming up and running into a brick wall, and that was the judiciary. Judges were, I found judges to be very insulated, misguided, misinformed. Um, the CNN watching, MSNBC watching
Hmm.
slash Facebook crowd, if you will, and it dawned on me: is this system? I've always thought the system of government that we put in place, this constitutional republic, was a stroke of brilliance. But now I've come to the realization that perhaps the judiciary piece of that is probably flawed. Why? Because we have human beings as judges, and human beings inevitably are biased, inevitably approach a court case with their own sets of biases and prejudices, and perhaps and often frequently will act outside the law and not apply the law that is on the books, perhaps reach the wrong legal conclusion. And I've, as much as I want to take a sledgehammer to that whole system, that's what we have. And I don't know how much you know about that issue, the judges, and I know you've written about Supreme Court appointments, so perhaps you do have a view on this. But how do we fix that piece of it? Because the judiciary is often where the liberals run if they want to change something. That's how they take a sledgehammer to something. They run to
Right.
court, they file a lawsuit, and they get some misguided judge to impose on the rest of us a new policy position. That's how Roe v. Wade came about. And so, and it makes a mockery of the Constitution. How do we go about changing that piece of it without tearing it all down?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say the caveat of the three branches of government, the judiciary is the one I'm probably the least qualified to weigh in on.
Sure.
It would obviously be 10 times the expert I am on that matter.
But
Um,
a fresh perspective often helps, believe it.
sure. And so let me just say I'll give a very general broad answer,
Mhm.
which is the problem with the judiciary branch, and maybe I shouldn't say problem, the structure of the judiciary branch is such that it is the most insulated from popular sways by design. And I think in a perfect world, we could say, well, that's a good thing, right? I know we air quotes elect judges in certain regards in lower courts. Um, but it's mostly insulated from people. Oftentimes, we're retained. I think I don't know how it works in other states. Here in Oklahoma, I think like judges are retained like at 99.9% of the time.
Mhm.
So it's it's a mostly meaningless symbolic gesture. They're mostly appointed. They are by design kind of insulated from those elections. Whereas Congress, the House of Representatives, the exact opposite. Every 2 years, in theory, we could throw every one of them out if we wanted to.
Right.
As a result, unfortunately, what you end up with is you're living with the judicial system of prior generations and what was in the ether of that time. And we had a more liberal orthodox order. Now, I think one could argue through George W. Bush, through Donald Trump, but also just through the rise of places like the Federalist Society, that is changing. And it could be that when you and I are old and gray or maybe dead, it'll be the left complaining about conservatives always get what they want done in the judicial branch. We've got to change that. Part of the beauty of the system is that it creates in theory, what you want are judges who are more reflective and cerebral, and they're kind of steeped in the tradition of our culture and our laws. And so therefore they're not beholden to the most recent sways of public opinion. Um, I don't have an immediate answer for how you fix that when you end up with
Yeah.
something like activist judges. I don't at all deny that there's probably need for reform in the system. Um, I guess I would say as a broad comment, my biggest concern with talks about trying to reform things like the Convention of the States, for instance, trying to reform the Constitution, trying to reform our judicial systems, is if you can show me a Congress that is churning out legislation I can get behind and seems to be functioning, then I'm all about, okay, let's talk about reform. But my first focus is how do we fix Congress? Because I do think one of the problems with our judicial branch, one of the fatal flaws, unfortunately, in the federalist system and what the founders gave us, was this mistaken idea that all three branches of government would always jealously guard the power they were given. And that, for complicated reasons, has changed over the last many decades. Whereas in Washington, D.C., it turns out senators are mostly interested in running for president, congressmen are mostly interested in running for Senate. They could care less about this business of actually legislating.
Mhm.
That's, they're more and more and more giving that to the executive and the judicial branches who are just eating it up. And so we've got this whole thing out of whack that I don't have an easy answer to your question, because I think the mechanisms whereby we could effectively reform things are themselves broken. And so it's almost like I mentally have to start further down the line. How do we
Sure.
reinvigorate Congress to take its central role in legislating? Then maybe we can have a conversation about how do we effectively fix the courts.
Do you think term limits would have any effect on that?
Possibly. I'm here in Oklahoma. We have instigated term limits in multiple levels. I think term limits are an interesting idea that themselves come with a lot of maybe unintended consequences.
Mhm.
One of which is you end up empowering the lobbyist, that you incentivize that individuals don't know how to work the mechanisms of government because they're not there that long, and so therefore they're more beholden to the lobbyist. Um, I think a balanced approach. I would love it if we had more term limits, say in the chairmanship or vice chairmanship within committees, but sometimes those are decisions that had to take place within the parties themselves.
Mhm.
Um, I think it would improve some things and possibly cause other problems.
I think it was, Thomas Paine who wrote about whether it would be prudent to, or whether the people who should run for Congress should be, individuals who own businesses and who have some skin in the game, some skin in the economy, as opposed to allowing lawyers to run for for those positions, because lawyers often don't understand. If you don't own a business, if you're not in society working and feeling the impact of a particular piece of legislation, then you don't really know what's going on. Lawyers often don't understand the impact, and people who are in those positions who have never run a business before often don't understand how a particular piece of legislation is going to affect business owners, the economy, working families. Do you think that and I'm not saying that that's a solution, but do you think something along those lines might improve the caliber of people who are in Congress?
Are you saying if we, the people, stopped electing lawyers, or are you saying if we ban lawyers from running?
Well, I just don't I don't know if that's possible, but
Yeah.
something to that effect, because I think what we have in Congress is often is you have people who implement a certain policy as legislation because of their own it's their own pet project, or it's they're trying to satisfy the whims of their constituent of a particular block in their party, and they're often doing it without any regard for how that law is going to affect the economy, or how that law is going to affect the 98% of small businesses who are comprised of one or two people, who are essentially sole proprietors. And that's a problem that I come across all the time when I see, God knows whatever $1 trillion bill is being pushed the week. And I don't know how to solve that. I mean, something as simple as let's get the people out of there who don't truly have that understanding. I don't think that's that simple. Is there any other way to shift people's thinking when they're in those positions?
No, it's a good question, and I don't know that I would have a satisfactory answer. I would say that I am generally supportive of the idea that we need fewer attorneys in Congress. Sign me up for that. That's a good idea. Um, and I'll speak as a citizen of the state of Oklahoma, and I work for the state auditor's office, and we audit government. Here at a local level, anyways, we do manage to, that's what you see on every brochure is, small business owner. Every political flyer. This guy has run a successful business, and that's why he's running. I have a natural aversion to sort of believing that a Congress staffed predominantly or exclusively of small businessmen is necessarily going to be an improvement. I
Mhm.
think it will improve some things. I think we get tort reform done for the first time, and meaningful tort reform, for example. Uh, but I don't. I think that businessmen and women themselves, do have natural ways of looking at the world. That while they do identify some problems well, which you've outlined well, they may also have other incentives in which they're not dealing with other problems well. As a general rule, I want a Congress that is more reflective of the United States, like
Mhm.
maybe fewer attorneys, but still attorney. It's a body of legislators, so we do need attorneys running around because
Right.
that is one of the skill sets that's probably most invaluable. We do need businessmen, and probably in greater quantities. I would like to have more CPAs in Congress. I'm a CPA. I would like to
Yeah.
have more maybe teachers in Congress. And it's not that these things don't exist, but I think we have, and there's a number of reforms floating out there. Like, should we lift the cap on you can only have 435 of these people? The odds of me running into my congressman, let alone influencing them in some capacity, is nil. Just because there's so few of them. So should we? Maybe that's an interesting idea. Reform. Maybe we can make it more reflective of the people of the United States in that regard.
Mhm.
Because we've created a scenario in which, unfortunately, attorneys and people with deep pocketbooks are about the only ones that can win in these races. It's hard to, the small businessman can win if that small business becomes an enormous success. I don't know that that's necessarily reflective of all of the interest and complexities of the general population.
Yeah. It's a complicated issue for sure. You familiar with Governor Ron DeSantis?
Yes.
He was my roommate in law school, and
Seriously?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
He so I and he was a congressman before he became governor, right? So I was in his house when he launched his congressional campaign, and yeah, this is your statement about only people with deep pockets and people with connections and so on are the ones who can get into these positions. So he was a lawyer at the time at a law firm in Jacksonville, and when he launched his campaign, I went down to visit him in Jacksonville. He had whiteboards everywhere with names, and he had legal pads, and just it was a disaster. I'm like, what is going on here? So he explained to me that he would, so he'd get home from work 5 o'clock, and he'd spend he'd eat dinner 6 o'clock to midnight. He'd get on the phone and he would just call. He did his undergrad at Yale Law School at Harvard, and he would just call Yale and Harvard alumni and essentially introduce himself and beg for money. And his goal was to raise $1 million for his campaign, and he did it and beyond. But it is that scene turned me off completely from ever running for office, and I still think about it. I've got people asking me to run for state legislature here in New Hampshire, and I am, and it just still, I still think about it, and I don't know why I do, but that scene in his house totally dissuaded me from ever doing that. And I think that kind of thing disincentivizes many people from undertaking such an endeavor. I think that's another issue.
And as I'm sure you're well aware, sitting members of Congress are, required by their parties, Republicans and Democrats both do this, to spend an inordinate amount of time making phone calls just for fundraising purposes.
Right.
It is a machine. Now, I don't, maybe in some utopia, there's a way in which the American people, I don't know who, I get these mailers from Congress. The ads are always designed to appeal to the lowest common denominator voter. I don't know who is out there seeing this thing as, oh, this guy has businessman written on his card, I guess I'll vote for this guy.
Right.
But it works. It obviously is an effective machine. I don't know how you turn off the machine. I think there's a certain degree, and maybe this goes back to the conservatives' kind of negative view of mankind. Is part of this is it's just the way you humans are hardwired. I get it. I don't know. It's not only the word. Politics feels icky, and this has always been the problem. How do you elect individuals who are genuinely decent people, but also have the animalistic instinct to play the icky game to get done what needs to be done? And that has always been a problem. It's just the whole Machiavelli, approach is like, how are you, at some point, is this all just a big cynical game? Are we all just being punked?
Well, yeah, I don't think there's any easy way to solve it. Our last question, and I'll tell you a quick story before I ask you. But what I want to ask you about is society is so divided right now, and you touched on this earlier. The energy on the right, I think, is even more palpable now than it was in 2016. Just because Trump lost doesn't mean that went away. That is even more prevalent now. And the left is as loud as ever. There is a significant divide right now. And what I want to ask you about is, how do we bridge that? And can it be done with conservative ideas? And I'll tell you a quick story. 2 years ago, it was the third lawsuit that I filed on behalf of a client. We were challenging a mask mandate implemented by the city of Nashua in New Hampshire. This guy called me and he hired me, and I had various legal arguments for challenging it. Among them was, the city had no authority, no statutory authority to be doing this kind of thing. And the details of that I'll spare you for now. Perhaps it's another conversation in the future. But when I got to talking to this guy, it's very interesting. He was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And he knew very well I voted for Trump. I'm a conservative. He knew where I stood, and we just kind of got to talking about all that. But I found it so interesting that he and I were aligned, and I was his lawyer, so I was obviously representing him. But if you throw all that out, I agreed with him. I didn't think a city should be implementing a mask mandate like that. And I found it fascinating, and perhaps this gives me some hope, that he and I agreed on that one issue. And he believed in freedom of speech. He believed in that concept, and he didn't think that a government should be telling him what to wear, what to put on his face, in those circumstances. And I found it fascinating. Is there a way to find common ground like that in today's discourse?
I think that there is. I don't think it's going to be easy. And I also don't think it's going to be comfortable. I think what gives me hope, I think it was a couple of weeks after the January 6th incursion on the United States Capitol, a friend of mine who is very progressive called me and asked if I would be interested in starting with him what we ended up calling a civil discourse group that intentionally got together conservatives and progressives to talk about the divide in the United States and try to understand it.
Mm.
Now, I don't think anyone in that group is under any delusions that we're solving world problems or that we're going to change the mind of the other person. But what was interesting is I have noticed this more and more. In the midst of the growing partisanship, there also appears to be growing awareness that this is a problem. And if you project it outward, where is this headed and what could we be doing different about it? And I do hope that multiple individuals thinking through this will eventually land on some solutions or at least alleviate the problem in a way that's not immediately apparent. One of the, because you mentioned conservatism. Yeah, I think conservatism in a lot of ways would help. If it properly understood and properly implemented, I think it would help some of these things. One of the things in American conservatism I'm trying to uphold is federalism, right?
Mm.
And this is what I mean by being uncomfortable, like an issue like mask mandates. And this may be something you fiercely disagree with, and you're welcome to push back if you do. That maybe one of the ways forward is a growing comfort around the very uncomfortable idea that different communities are going to do things differently, things that we might even strongly disagree with, and trying to learn how do you walk that line of what is truly a federal issue. I don't know how the pro-life, pro-choice debate ever gets resolved at a local level, maybe, but I think ultimately there's just fundamental differences there. American slavery is another, probably the main example. I don't know that you ever resolve that locally, but the vast majority of issues you do. The old war you may have heard of between Sohrab Ahmari and David French that started within conservatism, and Ahmari accused French of being a milk toast conservative, not serious, not fighting well enough. He took issue with David French because David French was okay with the fact that somewhere in California, transgendered men were dressing up like women and reading school children. I forget what they called this thing, but that was the thing that set them off. Now, you can agree with that, you can disagree with that, you can think it's terrible. His French's colleague Jonah Goldberg pointed out that 100 years ago, if two dudes in Chicago said, "Did you hear what happened in California? This guy dressed like a woman and read to kids," the other person's response would probably not be, "We need to change the culture in Washington, D.C." And that is the problem today. Whether or not you agree with whether or not that should happen, every freaking thing comes down to what is the Supreme Court, what's the makeup of the Supreme Court, who is the president. I think that's a very conservative idea. I think we need to reignite that kind of, you know what, those people do life different, and that's okay.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think that I'm a federalist. I believe in the idea that we need to push down a lot of these issues to the state and local level and let them be dealt with there. These are not federal issues. Abortion should not be a federal issue. Gay marriage should not be a federal issue.
Yeah.
When we rely on the federal government or rely on the court system and push a dispute, a challenge to an abortion restriction, and push that up to that's happening now because we have federalized the abortion issue. But any of these other social issues, when we are relying on pushing them up the courts and getting that issue in front of the Supreme Court and have the court rule on it, we are lending ourselves to essentially tyranny. How are 9 unelected lawyers in black robes supposed to decide this issue? How do they know more than Joe Smith and Sally Jane at the local level about how, their children should be educated in school? So I think that that's possibly an opportunity for finding a way to bridge this divide on some of these issues, because if people would always ask, whenever I tell people Roe v. Wade should be overturned, obviously if I say that to a liberal, they become apoplectic. And then they're like, well, what are women going to do? What is a woman supposed to do if she wants to get an abortion? And they fail to understand that you're just going to have 50 different states deciding how to deal with that issue. And you know what? The majority of them are going to legalize abortion. You're going to be fine. And if it's for some reason, if it's not legal where you are, you simply drive it to another state and get the procedure done there. It's no different than someone going from New Hampshire to Boston to have a surgical procedure. And I think that's a really good point, that perhaps take any given issue and start some kind of a discourse where people can perhaps arrive at an understanding that, you know what, the federal government doesn't need to be dealing with this stuff. This is an issue that should be decided on a community by community basis, and if two communities reach different results, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. I think that's a great point, and I definitely agree with that. I don't think it's perhaps uncomfortable for people who don't believe that different communities can reach different results or different people can reach different opinions, but that's simply a feature of society that I feel like a lot of people need to begin accepting.
It is it's an attitude that is difficult for us for two reasons. One is technology, and that's kind of where that Jonah Goldberg idea of,
Yeah.
guys in Chicago wanting to affect the change in Washington, D.C. Because it turns out I can, with the holding the phone in my hand, learn about all of the insanity taking place in this world. And it's very disconcerting. So I want to do something about it. But the other thing, this transcends technology and time and place, is this is a very Burkean idea. When you have, and it's also a Robert Nisbet idea, when you break apart the family, when communities are themselves not strong,
Mhm.
what you tend to be left with, and this is kind of what we're talking about earlier, is radical individualism versus collectivist state. And one of the things I think conservatism seeks to, one of those goods Roger
Mhm.
Scruton talks about
Yeah.
that conservatism seeks to protect, is the countless intermediary institutions that stand between me and the state, that allow me to imbue my life with meaning and purpose and goodness and enjoyment. And when those things are lacking, federalism is really hard to come by.
Yeah.
Being uncomfortable with how other people live is very hard to do. So I think part of this is what we as individuals can do. How do we bolster these local institutions? Not conservatism is not how do we tear them apart. Maybe there's some that should be torn apart, but we need to be really focused on what can we be building up, because that is the best insulator against the collectivist state.
That's a great point. Well, I wanna thank you for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate your time. I know you're very busy. Where could people go to find, your podcast and your blog?
The podcast is easy. If you got a podcast platform, I think I'm on all of them. Saving Elephants.
Okay.
As I mentioned, compete with people saving actual elephants. So if you're trying to find me online, savingelephantsblog.com.
Awesome. Um, this is very interesting. I really, I appreciate and admire your knowledge about conservative thought and all the individuals behind it, and all of the literature that you cited. I think that's very helpful. Provides a lot of guidance, and I think people will too. I'd love to have you on in the future if you got time. Perhaps we could maybe
Yeah,
focus on a more specific topic or writer, because there's so much out there, and I think that it's a great way of explaining these concepts to people.
great. I appreciate it. Thank you for letting me come on. I definitely enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh.